In today's episode of the Hunter Valley PaleoZoo, we'll turn the default Jurassic World aviary into an incredible tropical house, home to a walk-through Caiuajara habitat as well as an Austroraptor Enclosure, visible from both a ground path and a fully built custom elevated walkway. My name is Supersaurus, and as always I hope you're having a wonderful day and welcome back to the channel. This build has been in the works for quite literally months, but I genuinely couldn't be more happy with how it turned out. In fact, I reckon this build tops the Compy Bistro as my favourite build I've ever done. But with that out of the way, the speed build has started. So as you can see over here, I've dug down into the terrain where we're going to be placing our aviary. And what this does is with the elevated terrain you're allowed to do in the aviary, I'm able to get rid of all that extra height, which just makes the build feel a bit more realistic. The base aviary just felt a bit too high for this build. So just by digging it down, we can make it feel a little more in line with a realistic size build. Now, once I'm happy with the shape of the actual aviary itself, you can see that I used some terrain just to work out the general guide for the enclosure. So planning out the elevated walkway with the snow, and then the path in the Austroraptor enclosure there, which you can also see I have blocked out with rocks because we're using the aviary glitch the hatchery glitch to get the Austroraptors into this enclosure. And once they're in there, there's no way to get them out. So I need to make sure they stay exactly where I want them to. So that's why we've built that temporary fence there. Now moving on to the elevated walkway, I'm starting out with the guardrails for this, and you'll see a quick picture up there on what my inspiration for this fence and walkway is. But I really wanted to have, as you saw there, those angular type shapes really kind of jutting out at parts, making little viewing areas, as well as being really interesting to look at. So that's why I'm going for the fence first, and then we'll fill it in with the floorboards, which you'll see me making in a second. So once I'm happy with the shape of the fence and the colors there, you'll see we start going around and just placing it all the way roughly around where I put the snow. The snow isn't as precise as I'd like it to be, so using it as a rough guide, and you can see their little jutting out bit and just kind of vibing it out as we go along. Really making sure that it's an interesting shape, and yeah, as you can see that it's done. You also see on the other two ends there, we've got a nice large area that's open. That's for like a more communal viewing area, as well as we'll have our access both via stairs and an elevator. You can also see over here I'm moving on to the floorboards. So I did try and use the bigger pieces, but I just wasn't happy with the size of the boards, and so I went for the obvious conclusion to that and make each board custom built. So there's about 23,000 pieces in this build, and 11,000 of those come from just this walkway, so it won't be on the workshop, thank you for asking. But yeah, so just making blocks of floorboards there, and we're just duplicating them all across, which you don't have to see the whole thing because it took me forever. So in about a couple seconds here, we should cut to when it's complete. You can see that I'm aligning it up with the barriers of the fence, and just kind of whenever they overlap, just lowering one slightly down to the ground. And you can see here as well, making sure that there's no gaps in the concrete, which not only acts as structural support lore-wise, but also makes the whole walkway feel seamless and, and nice to look at from underneath. Now there's two main zoos I've taken inspiration from for this whole tropical house combined, those being the Marwell Zoo and the Birkenhof Tropical Zoo in Germany, which you'll see the main inspiration from that when we build the entrance into this building. The walkway you saw I showed the picture from, that was inspiration from the Cologne Zoo. And I also take a bit of other inspiration from other walkthrough aviaries and tropical houses just around the world. Now what I'm working on over here is the elevator. And this is for accessibility. It was also just something I wanted to have a go at building. We'll build this as a glass elevator. And it was really quite a challenging build to do, and getting all of those parts of an elevator, really making it look realistic. So over here I'm working on the door, and this goes through quite a few iterations. This part here stays the same, but the areas around the door, and making it look real when the only transparent glass piece we have is the skylights. It was quite a challenge, but it was really enjoyable. So the first iteration over here was looking at adding glass to the sides. I ended up changing that out because these doors need a place to be able to slide out. And I also move it back because the door needs to be more indented, but we get to that later. So over here building the main chassis, I guess you could say, of the elevator. Forgive me, it's been a while since I made this. I've forgotten all my elevator terminology I learnt while building this. But yeah, you can see what I was saying there. We changed that out for the metal post pieces just to give the doors an area where they would slide out. It's over here just making sure the barrier lines up, because obviously the gap there wasn't the same size as the elevator, so I just had to make it nice and flush. Now moving on to the elevator car over here, you can see I'm using these barrier pieces. I can't remember the name of them. for the life of me, but I'm so sorry about that. But you can see that I just use them as a nice thin metal flat piece, and using posts probably would have worked, but it would have been a lot thicker, a lot more piece intensive. And also the posts don't look great next to each other. They kind of have like markings on them and stuff, which it works fine just as a post, but when you're trying to make a wall out of it, it's going to be really obvious. So we use these pieces here, and you can see I made it a bit too thin on the first time, so just changing that out, making it a bit bigger. You also see we add a second door on the elevator cart. Elevators have two sets of doors, one in the cart and then one on the actual wall, so doing that for a bit of realism there. We add a roof and a floor, and now I'm working on the air conditioning units and all the stuff that goes on top of the elevator car to that is required for maintenance to make the elevator actually run, as well as the air conditioning there just for comfortability. And you can see here in regards to that, we're making a guardrail over here, so when the mechanics and stuff need to fix the aircon or something, wiring of the elevator, they'd have to come on top of here, and just for safety, we make these railings here out of the girder barrier pieces, not barrier, but structural support beams, and the fence posts from one of the metal painted fence sets. See there, just moving that up and down, checking that it's all part of one group. And here I'm working on the wiring. I start off first with the electrical boxes. They were a bit too big and wasn't quite happy with them, so I end up using this fuse box piece from the wetlands pack. So yeah, we do that, and you see I use some bollards that act as stands for this to make it sit up a little bit. And I was really happy with how this was turning out. You see here, I'm adding these little posts. I had gone to my local zoo and taken a picture of the glass elevator, and while I was building this, I had it up, and I was like, I've got this little bit here and this little bit there. It was really quite an enjoyable build. Took a while. This is what you're watching here is the third attempt of building this elevator. But yeah, no, we got there in the end, super happy with the result, and while the whole build is not on the workshop, this elevator will be on the workshop, so check the description for that. It's in multiple pieces, so you don't have to worry about the positioning of the elevator car. You can move it up and down however you like. And yeah, it's a really great build, so make sure to check that out. You'll also find a bunch of other builds on my workshop from when they're under 5,000 pieces. So yeah, make sure to check that out, link will be in the description below. And here what we're working on is the elevator rails. So on both sides of the elevator, these are what the elevator car's moving up and down. You'll see I'm using those drain pieces, and if you were paying attention, you would have noticed that I flipped them around. The decal pieces in this game are only visible from one side, and while it's very useful for some things, in cases like this, where I want it visible on both sides of the glass, you need to make sure you're flipping that around. So just something to keep in mind when you're working with the decals is that all of them are only visible from one side, and just check that it's not, phasing out of existence if you turn around. So you can see that we added some railing and used the ropes as little guides as there. Well, now working on the roof here, just a simple roof using the panel pieces, just placing one down and then using smaller ones to kind of cover up that side texture there. And then digging down a bit to make sure it's flat, you'll see there for the exit to the elevator, and just using some concrete plaster pieces here to create a little foundation and start working on the ground path. See over there, I end up going for a little bit of terrain elevation. I think you saw it there, yeah, right here, making sure it's all flat because I want my life to be kind of easy. And then we do get onto the path later, but first here we're working on the staircase. See, I'm just using the default stairs that the game provides. There was really no need to go kind of extra on this. So just these pieces work great, and you can see I'm just kind of figuring out what shape I want these stairs to be. I don't want them just to go straight down. This staircase does actually change later on. I end up building one on the other side, and then I just copy and paste it over, and it works quite well. So you can see again over here, I'm like, do I want it to go straight down? I did want it to have some kind of, not curve, but angle to the staircase, and you can see how I'm just testing out how I want that to curve around. Not curve, but you know what I mean. Around there. And then once I'm happy with that, I use some of the floorboard pieces from the elevated walkway, just around here, and then the challenge comes of making the railing that I made work on an angle. So this took a little while. You can see there that the pieces phase through because it's not a parallel connection point there. But we do get there in the end, and just playing around with the heights and all of that and making that work. See, I kind of get two lined up here, and then I duplicate those, just get it up, looking all nice, and then it's, yeah, kind of taking out the mesh, and because the mesh was the hardest part, all of these other little pieces can be easily duplicated, but getting that mesh right was a pain, and I decided it's not worth it. So just decided to use a bunch of these little string pieces over here to create a different barrier. It's technically not the same, it's not mesh, but trying to get those mesh pieces to line up would have been impossible, to be pretty quite frank, without being, making a custom mesh. Placing individual lines like that is already a lot. I don't need to place down more to make an actual mesh there, and it looks fine. So we do that all up. See here, just making sure it's all lined up in parallel with the floorboards and the stairs, and making sure it looks all nice. You'll see here we just move the posts up without actually changing the fence there. And just like that, I've copied it over to the other side. Actually see I changed the connection point there just to make it fit in nice. And now I start working on a little bit of foliage here, just picking a nice big tree, kind of stand in the center here as a center point around here. I end up going with one of those Brazil nuts, Brazil nut trees. And here I'm working on the ground path. So using plaster pieces because they have a really nice texture to them. And I just basically copy that across the terrain texture guide I painted, and then we cover that all up with the dirt texture. And in the center here, it was feeling a bit barren, so I thought, why not make a nice little planter area and just put a palm tree in there before going on to adding some of my ferns. So as always, I like to go for my big foliage first and then fill it out with the smaller stuff. So we placed quite a few king ferns, changing it up, and then going on to some tree ferns before I move on to another big plant, the bamboo. So see here, placing lots of lovely clumps and just checking where it hasn't clipped out of the aviary. So you'll see I do that quite a lot if I haven't cut it out. Like I said, I don't know if I mentioned this, there was an hour and a half worth of sped up footage, which is crazy. So getting it even down just to 40 minutes means a lot of the processes, I'll show you the start and then I'll cut to the end because you don't need to see it all. So yeah, doing a bunch of rock work around here, highlighting the terrain elevations. It's a really great tip if you have an enclosure with a lot of terrain elevations, which is great. Terrain, having height differences in elevation really brings out the enclosure, makes it stand out. But also adding rocks around the edge to highlight it works wonders as well and really makes it obvious and pop. See here when I mentioned the, what was it? The Birkenhof Zoo. I used as the inspiration for the entrance there, and I just planned out there with the concrete pieces before moving back onto the foliage. My brain likes to work and do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Sometimes I manage to get it all out in one go, but see there, I start on the house before, or the entrance to the house, and then just moving on to foliage, placing in lots of nice big trees and really giving it that nice tropical look. And then I was flying around and I noticed this wasn't quite lined up, so we give it a little fix there, making sure it's all looking perfect. Now, here I sadly forgot to record the start of me actually building this, but I just placed a few wall pieces. You guys can do that, so that's okay. And then here I am placing in a little kind of jungle-y, like, entrance vivarium, I guess would be the word for it. Just kind of like showing off this is the tropical house. Maybe there'd be a few little statues in there or something, I don't know. But yeah, you'll see a picture on the screen now of the entrance I used as inspiration from the Birkenhof Zoo, I got it that time. And yeah, see, that's what we're trying to build here. See that I made out just a little bit darker wood. I do change it again. But yeah, just doing that because I didn't really like the wood just felt a bit too light. We actually changed the colors again. But here I'm working on that lovely kind of triangular roof that you would have seen in that image. This is the second attempt. You can see the remnants from when I tried to do it out of the corrugated iron pieces. But there's an issue with the angles. They were too sharp, too big. The pieces are too big. They're clipping for each other. Just wasn't working. So we decided to do the old pride and faithful, make it out of custom smaller pieces and then hate yourself later. So you can see that I've kind of planned out where I want the little entrance sign to be. That T-Rex, there's no T-Rex in here, but it's the only dinosaur sign in the entire game, which is crazy. That doesn't come with text or anything, so I use that out of necessity, but it doesn't look bad at all. And then you can see that I've used the plank pieces and metal post pieces to create this gridded look, to kind of like slats. So that worked really nice, really happy with how that turned out. And you can see that placed in some glass pieces just as a kind of like to give the illusion. Obviously I can't do an interior for this building because there's the wall of the aviary in the way, but by putting the glass on both sides, even though there is the wall of the aviary in there, at that point it's glass, so it kind of gives the illusion that it's an open building and that I've done an interior even when I really haven't. So that's why we do that, and it works really well. You don't look at it too closely, and it just feels like, yep, that's a building, there's an interior there. So we do that. You can see here I'm adding a little tropical house sign using their letters, making a nice little yellow and green sign there. See here now doing the house in a slightly bigger font to kind of, yeah, I think it looks really cool. And then just checking the spacing on that before moving on to the finishing off the roof. So you can see here I'm making kind of one little section here, adding out this little jutting side, and then we'll use corrugated metal, which you'll see right here, to add a nice little white roof, and then adding on a little roof cap there for a bit of interest. I'm going to copy that all the way across, and you can see there what I mean about the glass of the aviary, but you can't tell from outside, especially since it's high up. So we just add in some wood pieces here to act as like a rafter kind of thing, just to cover up the terrain. And then also to cover it up further, you would have noticed there were like some butterfly decals inside the window. We don't have that, so I kind of made these myself. I thought it was a really cool idea. You see here I'm messing around with the primitive shapes, trying to create this kind of like, it was meant to be a butterfly at first. It kind of just looks like a generic prehistoric insect now, but I think that looks, I'm really happy with it. I think it turned out really cool. You'll see we'll do a one that's this size in green, and then I'll make a little smaller one and put that in orange. See, adding a few little antennae here as well. I think it looks really cool. It's like a moth kind of butterfly thing. I think it looks really cool. So you can see that we put those on both sides, and that just like covers it up, but you can still see through to the end, so it works out really nicely. Then here adding some ivy, some planters, just giving it an extra tropical look, and then adding what I did there was add a little plaster open area rather than using the default paths. Now what we're doing over here is getting our low barrier fences. If you want to see me make those, I did it in the Dinosaur Enclosure. So that's where you can find that, and then I've just copied that over and added them all the way around before we start working on the temple viewing area for the Austroraptor Enclosure, which we'll move on to shortly. You can see here I'm taking those same plastic pieces we used for the floor to kind of shape out the area I want to use as this viewing gallery. And you can see they're just moving out the rocks out the way to make room for the walls. So I wanted to go, like I said, for a temple aesthetic. So the first thing I tried were these rocks over here, which kind of worked, but I wasn't really feeling it fully. So I tried a few other things, and you'll see we actually land on using these brick pillar pieces. So you see I placed one of those there for like the column support, and then placing these turned 90 degrees and next to each other as a support for the glass there. You see we just use a concrete pillar, you'll see in a second here after I move that a bit closer, just like that, as the main wall for this temple. See, I'm just playing around with the heights and then working out how to top this. So I look at wood, but I wasn't really feeling it. So you can actually see here, we'll take those bits up there, but then turn them 90 degrees again, just like that. Actually, no, I think I just moved them straight up. So yeah, we make that line up properly with the height and also the color, and then place some of those more pieces and actually use some of the fossil pieces here to kind of like be embedded. The elevations of those pieces worked out really perfectly for that, so I'm really happy with how that turned out. And then adding a few crack pieces here into the concrete to make it look a bit older and a bit decrepit. So really happy with how that turned out. You see I just copied that all the way across, add another pillar on the side, and you can see there we start playing around with a bit of water for the enclosure, which we do end up adding a concrete base for in a second, which actually we might be doing right now. So you see here, I'm kind of working out where the base layer is, and then from there, what we'll do is grab some of the non-grid pieces. Well, I do actually think about making that kind of like barrier around there. Wasn't feeling it though. So take those pieces and I make a little kind of edge for the pool. So you can see there, I copy these around using a flat piece and then a sloped piece towards the end to kind of like fade it out into the natural terrain that was there. Because for some reason in this game, depending on what terrain paint you do, it changes the terrain. It's really annoying when you're trying to make something flat, but it's whatever it is what it is. We live with it. So you can see that I've connected all of those up around to the edge, just like that. And then after that, we end up, actually maybe I haven't done the, yeah, sorry. So here is where I do the slope bit. That was just the flat. We do it though, obviously, as you can see here. And that just like kind of smooths it out into the terrain. and makes it look nice and complete. It also just acts as there not being a big step for the animal, that just makes it smoother, blends in nicely, and looks really good. So after we do that, I change the color of those plaster pieces we put down at the bottom. And now what I'm doing is just again using some elevated pieces that I kind of align to surface with one part of the pool. I'm kind of covering the whole thing, and you can see that it's very fiddly, kind of fixing it all up, but look, it's done now. It actually took me a lot longer than that, as I'm sure you can imagine. But yeah, so that looks really good in the end. You can see here I'm making a variant of that temple wall piece that doesn't have the glass to make the rest of the building out of. And I use these stone pieces over here, which we changed to a more darker color that kind of blends in nicely, just like that. So now that I've done that, I'm trying to work out the shape. Do I want a roof on this? How do I want it to kind of work? So we place those there, kind of get those lined up with the entrance we made with the path there underneath the walkway. And then when I moved those, I hadn't had the cracks in the group, so I have to fix that up. But once that's done, it's now time to work on a roof. So I actually took a bit of inspiration for this from a build that a lady designer did, who's another YouTuber who does Planet Zoo stuff. She'd made a jaguar enclosure that was like based off a temple, and I thought the viewing gallery there was really cool. And so that's where the inspiration for this came from. You can see, and you would have seen an image of that on the screen. And so we use the wetland board pieces to kind of create that. And you will also see while I'm adding these pillars here that I discovered another light piece that works in the day, the wall lights. So I made those, gave it a nice like kind of warm yellow tint, and kind of put those on the side, and it just makes this room feel a bit lighter and kind of creates this nice mood lighting in there. So really happy for that. Otherwise it was really dark. So thank you, Frontier, for at least giving us some pieces that light up in the day, even if it's not many. Still, we desperately need that option to turn lights on in the middle of the day, but alas, we can make do. You can see here I'm adding some ivy all the way around the build, hanging off to really give it a nice overgrown temple look, and then adding a few benches in there as well, before adding some foliage around. You also notice I did place a few of those rocks around the edge there that I was playing with making the walls out of. I think they look really nice in that capacity though. And you can see here adding some more ivy, a few more floorboards on the top, or boardwalk pieces. I can't remember the actual name of them. And then more palms, looking at adding a few flowers and some scaevola bushes, which we place a lot of in this build, and you'll see that later. But obviously, these animals would have some form of climbing / jumping ability, so we need to use a fence that has anti-climbing or like a lip to it. And you'll notice, again, I took that from the Deinonychus enclosure because that one works great. Why should I make myself build another one? And also it makes it fit in with the rest of the park. Obviously in a build like this, it's very different in terms of biome, so adding those similar elements really helps gel it all together. So we go around and place those fences just against the elevated walkway, which you saw. And now I'm working on, just in the Austroraptor enclosure, covering up the concrete here with some of these big jungle rocks, or tropical rocks I think they're called in the game. So you can see I've taken some of those to create this piece, and the reason I'm placing 2 at a time is because when I rotated them, it meant that the Z-axis, which the base rotation is on, wasn't in the right location. So by making them into a group, by placing 2, you can reset the axis that you're turning on there. So I placed a few of those around, and then you can see I'm working on a backstage area for the Austroraptor, just planning it out at this point. We finished off at the end of the speed build. You can see here I'm kind of lining up a door for both the humans, the zookeepers, as well as making sure that's the right scale for the Austroraptors to be able to fit through. And then on the other side, just kind of lining it up so that it feasibly works. We cover that up later, but you'll see that when we build the indoor area. So now just finishing off with the rocks, making sure they kind of fit around the doors there. And so we actually use a few other rock pieces here, particularly this one. I forget the name of it, but that's okay. I'm sure you guys can find it. Just to kind of line it up, and then also making the color of the door that similar brown color so it blends in and doesn't stand out to the guests. See over here I've made a little collection of flat rocks, which I'm also using just to cover up any gaps in the concrete and make it all look nice and seamless there. And I go all the way around and do that, but I don't think I show you that because that's boring. So yeah, doing a little bit more there. You will see here as well that I use some of the soil pieces to kind of create a garden bed over here. We place a lot of those around this build. You'll see a bit of it, but that's okay. See, I'll place a bunch of soil pieces to cover up the terrain because the aviary kind of forces this gravel texture around the edge, which I didn't really like. So anyway, you'll see that later, but you also notice that I placed a few scaevola bushes along the top. I do that all the way around, and here I'm working on making a little fake waterfall. Well, it's a real waterfall, but you know, not using the in-game waterfall mechanics, using the fountain pieces kind of shoved all together to create a nice stream of water, and then covering up with some rocks. If you know another YouTuber called Paleo Pizza, I know he watches fan of the channel, likes to leave a comment. Thank you, I appreciate that. He often does waterfalls in a similar way to this, so if you want more speed builds kind of showing this technique off, make sure to check out his channel. He does some amazing stuff. And yeah, so using some rocks just to cover up that concrete, and then here I'm looking at kind of making a ledge almost, like a little kind of support beam for this, and I end up just using these little rocks rather than the big heavy ones there. And I think that turned out really good. See, again, I cover all of this up with more foliage. Well, not all of it, but a lot. See, again, here adding in some soil pieces there and some scaevola bushes to give it a nice tropical look, and even a king fern or two. Well, one king fern and then palms and stuff. Really happy with how the foliage work for this work came out, but it was a lot of it. So you can see that adding in more scaevola bushes, tree ferns, lobster claws, the cabbage tree palms, the shosha plants, so many different tropical plants we use here. And you'll see those all throughout. But here I'm just adding on to the temple theming around this area, adding a few extra ruins, so taking one of the walls and shoving it into the ground at an angle, adding some ivy, using some more of those rock pieces, and then you saw there I used some of the brick bases again as a staircase to kind of like, as a general rubble ruin stuff. Now here you'll notice that I spent a bit of time just watching the Austroraptors. In a moment you'll see I actually decide to add a third one in. This is where I was starting to get suspicions, like I think this enclosure could hold a third, but like I mentioned at the start, if I add one in and I don't like it, I can't take it out. So you'll see when I do that, I end up making a backup, and I'll walk you through what I was doing there when we get to it. But right now I'm just adding some benches, some seating. Also notice there one of the signs that I've been using from that blueprint pack. I forget the name of it, but I'll put it in the description below. And adding in a bunch of other rocks here, some more trees, particularly the kapok, Brazil nut, and all the palms, the Mediterranean ones, the coconut palms, as well as the lipstick palms, and even some of the cycads and stuff from the paleo brushes, which were really nice. I wish we had those as individual placeable plants as well, but oh well. Now what you're noticing I was doing over there is starting to add some individual soil pieces. Not only do I do this around the edge of the aviary in this enclosure to cover up that gravelly terrain to replace it with soil, but also around the edge of the water, it doesn't allow you to change the terrain. So again, I really wanted like a dirt mulchy kind of feel for this habitat, like it's all been, but the terrain has been, the substrate has been man-laid. But that doesn't really fit that vibe. So you can see there, I will place it around over that hill, as well as in around like this area over here as an example, where it just had this kind of uneven terrain, and I didn't like the look of it. So see over here, I'm placing those individual pieces. And how I'm doing that is using the 2x2s, sometimes scale down just like there, and aligning the surface and just bring it down so it's just above. And that way, if the animals decide to walk over it, they don't sink into it. Yeah, as well as just covering that up and trying to eliminate any weird texture juts and stuff. It's not possible to fully do it, which you'll see when we do that area over there by the viewing gallery. But in areas like that, it's pretty well done. So you can see over here, I'll show the start of me doing it around the edge of the enclosure over here. So yeah, just taking those pieces one at a time. There's a little gap there, so place another one. Kind of doing that around, and then I'll eventually cover those up with a rock barrier as well. You'll see I did it over here. And then once I do that, filling it up with a bunch of tropical foliage, like I mentioned before, all of our ferns, lobster claws, all of the great tropical plants, some cecropia trees I placed in there, lipstick palms, all of those plants, which look really good and really add that tropical feel, especially the scaevola plant, which I was using as the main ground cover in here. I do place some thyme bushes, I believe it is, towards a bit later, but for now, this is the main ground cover I was using, as well as adding in palms, like that nice date palm over there. I wish the date palms were taller. They are in Planet Zoo, but Oh well, they're not bad in this game by any means, and they look beautiful, but a slightly taller one would have been a bit more appreciated. So yeah, you can see at the end there, now I've covered up that whole area. And yeah, just place that little log over there. And I'm also kind of making sure that I haven't left any with collision on. I want the animals to be able to walk over here. I've never seen them do it, even though they can, which is kind of annoying. But just making sure that option's available to let them use as much of the habitat as possible. So yeah, that's why I'm going into management views, checking if I've left one on, because if I do, it's a massive debacle. If you are worried about collision, so you have a big tree in the habitat, you don't want the animals walking through it, but you also don't like that you'll see that gives a massive radius compared to the object. What you can do is just take a metal post, and I kind of discovered this while doing this, well, not discovered, sure people have done it before, and you leave collision on that, you turn collision off the tree, and you hide the post inside the tree. The radius for the post will be big enough to cover the tree, without having the massive extra radius that putting a collision on the tree would. So that's a little trick you can do. It allows the animals to get nice and close to objects without having collision on them. So you see there we placed a few more lights to add a bit more brightness, a bit more light to the temple viewing gallery over there, as well as just continuing on with the plants. King ferns, tree ferns, scaviolas, all of the good stuff which I've been mentioning. So yeah, just feeling all of that, you know, trying to leave as little of the dirt as possible visible. So over here, you see, yeah, to add some extra height, playing around with the scale. Sometimes I do have to make them smaller just so they don't bleed through the aviary, and you'll see that later when I go and do a lot of the foliage on this part of the enclosure over here. Yeah, playing around with some lipstick palms, adding a few fallen ones, playing around with a few logs, all of that kind of good stuff to add some nice storytelling and tropicalness, if that's a word. It is now. So yeah, as I was saying, cabbage tree palms and all of that kind of stuff, just filling up the rock wall over there as if it's a kind of like elevated planter. Realistically, that would be the most heavily growing stuff in there because the animals can't reach it. But it's a shame that, you know, we can't, obviously in real life the plants would grow in accordance with the structure of the aviary because they can't phase through it. But at least we can't do that, and they move around as well a lot, so you have to kind of, you know, it sucks, but oh well, we get it pretty densely planted without flipping through. You see over here I'm adding in some more thyme bushes just to add a bit more ground foliage, like some weeds and stuff growing for a bit of grass, all of that kind of good stuff, and just sinking it down to the ground. As well as working on some more taller foliage in this area of the habitat. You can see over here we're adding in some bamboo. As I was talking about, this does clip through the aviary quite a bit, so I have to go through and fix it all, and it means the plants end up being a bit smaller than I would have liked, but oh well, it is what it is. I'd rather have them smaller than have them clipping through and defying the laws of physics. So yeah, adding in all of those palms, lipstick palms, coconut palms, all the same stuff we've been doing before, keeping it nice and consistent and lush and tropical. Here you can see I'm taking some of those, the flat edge of those rocks, and just kind of placing them around as a little barrier, you know, sediment retainer, to stop that kind of mulch from going out into the rest of the habitat. Yeah. And also from a visual point of view in the game, it stops that from being that, you know, because obviously the soil in this is like a block, so it kind of stops you from seeing that, which is really nice. And just really working on the foliage, adding a few more trees over here, some cecropia trees, or date palms. You see we kind of like put those down low to the ground to kind of replicate the effect of the basket ferns from Planet Zoo, which I used to, well I still do love whenever I play Planet Zoo. Using those, and so kind of shrinking those down and rotating them in on themselves in the wall kind of gives that same, like, you know, overgrown fern look that you see coming out of cracks in the stone. You notice there with the K-pop tree I just planted, using some of the larger rocks and just those ridges on them, kind of sunken into the ground to act as like big roots, kind of reminiscent of a Moreton Bay fig tree, if you know what that is. It's a big tree native to Australia. They have these like awesome giant roots. I love one in game because they're just beautiful trees. But look one up if you're interested. They're really pretty trees. So you're kind of like replicating that kind of look, those like gnarly roots. They're really cool. And now we are working on the interior here of the backstage. So you see there, I've taken some of the in-game fences and just kind of working on these holding pens. So you see we've got 3 here, 1 for each individual. I must have cut it, I completely forgot where I added the 3rd individual. Anyway, sorry, I kind of mentioned what I was doing when I did that. Really sorry about that. I must have cut it and forgotten. Oh well. So yeah, you can see over here adding in the holding pens for the 3 individuals. Have over here, adding on these gates, and you'll see I add the gate on both sides and kind of like cover it up, and we'll use those to make heat feeding hatches. So you'll see those in a second. I was just quickly grabbing up an image of how I wanted those to look when I get to that. You can see here we add in a gate over here for human access. Obviously, humans, the keepers, will only be entering here when all the animals are locked inside of their holding pens there. So we add in some few gates and just add those onto each of the entrances here for the animals. So like I was saying, we go on to make these feeding hatches here, and what these do is kind of add a way for the keepers to either do husbandry checks if they need to check the teeth of the Austroraptors, or give them their food. So we add those bar gates there. They'll have sliding access, and you can see here on the other side I'm adding a feeding trough. So just using little girder pieces there to kind of line that up, and then adding on some rails for that door to slide through. So you can see there, just like that. Pull it aside, be remote controlled. You see I add a keypad onto it to kind of like unlock it. And then adding in from the Dilophosaurus enclosure, that little safety barrier there using the decal pieces, just as a kind of OSHA safety kind of thing, where it's like, past this line, the animals could hurt you. So just to keep in mind for keepers to not accidentally cross that line if they don't need to. And you can see over here taking some of those plaster non-grid pieces and just copying them around to kind of line up with the curve of the aviary without having the slant that the aviary wall has there. I would have liked to make this building a bit bigger, but I didn't want the bars running through it, and I thought, you know what, this is probably, this height's okay. Otherwise it kind of gets a bit messy with the aviary. So yeah, I add a few brackets onto those there, which I cut out there, but you saw me place in the first one, so that's all that matters. Before I take from the Compy Bistro some of the kitchen elements that we use. So that's the word, kitchen. And then yeah, editing this one to make a sink, and then adding a drain there, and then we start looking for a tap piece. I end up doing the pipes, but I found these boxes, like, oh, I'll quickly add a bit of those as the Backstage junk. So yeah, you can see I'm going through all the prop pieces, but eventually we do find the pipe piece. Yeah, you can see every time I'm finding something useful, I'm just placing that down, like adding a few tires for enrichment boxes, and then eventually we do find the pipe. But even here I'm like, oh, I could, some little transport containers for the animals would be needed if I need to go to the vet or something. So, make it bigger and add that while I'm still looking for a pipe piece. So yeah, do that, add a garage door to add for entry for vehicles to get those crates out, as well as an air conditioning unit, literally everything but what I was originally looking for. So yeah, going over here, I was playing with the lighting. You can see here we place in some of the night-only lights. I do actually change this, so I do this off screen, I keep these in, but I realised with the wall lights that are on during the day, if you just put them underneath the floor, there's like a slight distance you can have where they're not visible, but they still emit light as if they were above the ground. So I kind of spam underneath the floor with those lights, and it makes it bright, like the building would be. So finally found my pipe piece, by the way. So we get that in there, add a little tap, that looks good. And then I continue working on the kitchen here, adding in a island bench. But yeah, you'll see that in the cinematics with how bright it actually is. All the indoor shots in the cinematics are taken during the daytime when it comes to this building, so something to keep in mind for how well that technique works. You see over here making a few shelving units out of the girders, just making sure they have a little bit of height to each of those shelves. And then just removing the barriers on those ones that are on the wall. So there, I move out those crates and stuff out the way to make room for a freezer box. So this would be used to keep food for the Austroraptors, whether those be mice I've bought from a pet store, lamb shank, part of a kangaroo or something that is being used as carnivore food. All kinds of things would be in that freezer, but to keep it fresh for longer, well, freezer fresh, that's not the greatest combination, but they got to keep this food, safe to eat for as long as possible. So that would be why they'd be putting stuff in there, and then over here making a fridge for just other stuff that doesn't need to be frozen, and other stuff as well. And there'd be all kinds of stuff kept in there. You can see they're still keeping it light at night time, but just taking over the pieces I used from the elevator shaft the carriage walls to make the back of the fridge, making sure the hinges are on the right side of the fridge to be opened, and then using some of the painted girder pieces here to create the roof of that fridge. Just leaving a little bit at the front to, for the door. Obviously this fridge is not functional. That would be a stupid amount of work for that, but not that I'd be against it, probably. That would be the next episode. I'll make a working fridge. No. So yeah, the Addy is fun. Use those pipe pieces again to make a door. And over here, last thing we do is create a little non-slip mat before just fixing up a few other things backstage. This is just for health and safety in case the floor's wet, but I basically copy this around and then fix up backstage and then we're done. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you have enjoyed it, like, subscribe, leave a comment saying your favourite part or what you guys want to see next. I'll have a look. I have a pretty solid plan, but I'm always open to suggestions. Hope you've enjoyed this one. So long. Bye-bye.